So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Residents Present. First of all, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to make a plea to everybody that if you are so moved to do a Residents Present presentation, please contact me. And even if you personally are not, if you know of new people who've come who you think would give a great talk, would you let me know their names and I'll contact them? So anyway, it's always a bit of a struggle to make sure that the program is full, although we've been very blessed to have wonderful speakers. So this afternoon, we have a wonderful speaker, Judge Judith Barzilay. And Judge Barzilay was appointed in 1998 to the Court of International Settlement in New York. And she was also appointed after that by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to several other courts. Which courts are they called?
Okay, so can I take it away?
I'll let you in a second.
Okay.
Anyway, so she's going to tell us about American Jewish women from colonial times to the present. And she and her husband, Sal, arrived here about a year ago in May of 2022. And we're thrilled that they're here. And we're looking forward to her presentation.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So in contrast to some of the people, wind me up and I give a talk. So just as a background, when this book was first published in 2019, I reviewed it for our Temple Sisterhood in Florida. And it's in our library. Many of you have probably read it. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. The author is the chair of the Women's and Gender History at American University and the director of Jewish Studies at American University. Funny Jewish geography story. When the announcement of this went out in some of the Jewish publications, someone must have seen it and let the professor know I was doing this, and she found me on email, and we were able to conduct a very interesting email exchange, and she told me some of the background about why she wrote the book. The book inspired me to want to do research in some of the women that were covered in the book and some of the issues that were covered in the book. So I was finished with my lecture. I was scheduled to give this lecture to the Hadassah in Sarasota, and the lecture was scheduled for March 31st, 2020. Well, we all know what happened before I was able to give this lecture. So when Michael, I guess Prue called and I spoke to Michael, and I said, yes, I have a lecture all teed up, ready to go with nobody to deliver it to, and I'm going to pull my notes out and see if I can update it to give as a Residents Present. And so that's the story of how this actually came about. So I think I'm going to talk about the book a little bit, but as I said, I'm going to tell you some of my original research on the people and the issues. And what was unsurprising about the book, and those of you who've read it can tell me if you agree with me or not, how much the concerns of American Jewish women throughout history are the same as our concerns today. Our family, how to express our Judaism, and how to live in the wider world as Jews. The importance of education, our education and the education of others. Anti-Semitism, civic engagement, and advocacy and activism from the earliest days of the Republic, as I'm going to talk to you about. What was very surprising to me, though, and what I did not expect, was how much of our modern world was influenced by Jewish women, Jewish American women throughout the ages and their activities, their energy and their chutzpah have really created the world that we live in today, and I hope to be able to tell you about it this afternoon. Now, before I get started, a word about historiography, the study of history. Now, I'm not a historian, and I know we have historians in the audience, but I just want to make a note. How do historians find out about history? Well, they look at original documents. And it's difficult when women were confined to the home by themselves and society because they really didn't have a lot of original documents about them. Maybe they were mentioned in wills, maybe they were mentioned in marriage records, but there weren't a lot of documents. There wasn't a lot of original research about women's history. So when the professor talks about colonial history, and any time up until about just before the Civil War, she has to be very conditional. She uses language like, she must have, or it appears that. Nothing too definite unless there were letters or original documents with reference to these women. The story really takes off then when women begin to emerge from the home into the public sphere. And as I said, just before the Civil War, we'll get there soon. We all know that the first Jews came here from Brazil in 1654. There were 23 of them. We know the names of only 2 of the women. Their names were Richie Nunez and Judith Mercado, Sephardic names, right? Now, obviously, there must have been more women than that out of the 23, but we only know about these 2. At the time of the American Revolution, there were approximately 2,500 Jews in the United States, before the United States, in the colony. They lived in a diverse country, and they interacted with their neighbors. One of the most interesting and heartwarming interactions was in 1754, when the German Jews of Savannah, Georgia, shared their food and their language with newly arrived immigrants, Christian immigrants, Lutheran immigrants from Salzburg. Afterward, the pastors of the Lutheran immigrants wrote that the Jews shared so much love, no one could ask for more. Of course, it was hard, very hard, to be observant outside the 4 major cities with Jewish populations. At that time, they were Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, Philadelphia, Newport, and New York. One woman whose letters survived complained to her in-laws. She lived in Petersburg, Virginia, which is very close to where we came from, Williamsburg, Virginia. And she said that the kosher butchers bought treifa meat and they sold it for kosher, and that the Jewish merchants kept their stores open on Shabbat. And even though she and her husband had a very successful business in Petersburg, Virginia, they sold the business and they left, and they went to Charleston, South Carolina, which was a more frum community. There were many non-observant Jews, and there was a lot of intermarriage, even though it was frowned upon. More in the case of men than in the case of women. Many Jewish women did not marry because they did not want to intermarry. The early women asserted themselves in matters of religion, though, and we know that because of the report of a court case in 1765, a lawsuit over where women could sit within the women's section. It wasn't a lawsuit about whether they could sit in the regular, area. It was within the women's section in Sheheret, Israel, in New York, and the lawsuit was called the King versus Moses Gomez. Now, in 1765, the sovereign here was not the United States of America, was it? It was King George III, so that was the name of the lawsuit. In the late 1700s, women applied to be the shamash in Orthodox congregations in New York, and they were rejected. But in 1815, the widow of the shamash was appointed to take his place at Sheheret, Israel. Up until well into the 19th century, men and women's spheres were supposedly separate. The women's sphere was private, the home and family, and the men's sphere was more public, the public sphere and the civil sphere. The author says here that Jewish and non-Jewish American women truly began to step into public life. In the churches, in schools, in hospitals, they were interested in eradicating poverty. They were interested in preventing alcoholism, prostitution. The women in the North, slavery, dueling. In 1801, 15 Christian and 8 Jewish women in Philadelphia started the Female Association for the Relief of Women and Children in Reduced Circumstances. Rebecca Gratz, a name many of you will recognize, and Rebecca Phillips, who was her sister-in-law, were 2 of the founding members. Now, in the bylaws of this organization, they stipulated that the treasurer had to be an unmarried woman. Why? Because in 1801, when a man and a woman got married, there was only one legal entity, and that was the man. And the man had control of all the property, even if the woman brought property to the marriage. And the women who started this association did not want to get into the situation where their funds were being controlled by somebody else's husband. Now, that legal doctrine called coverture, it's a state law doctrine because family law traditionally belongs to the states. And by the 1880s, almost every state in the Union had done away with that. But in 1801, it was still in existence. Now, the Rebecca Gratz is a very, very interesting woman. She lived from 1781 until 1869. She was the first secretary of this particular organization, and she was the secretary for 22 years. She never wed. We think that she was in love with a non-Jewish man, but people, we don't have any proof of that. When Rebecca Phillips, who was her sister-in-law, died, she raised her orphan nieces and nephews. And in 1819, she started the Female Hebrew Benevolent Society. And 20 years later, in 1838, she started the first Hebrew Sunday school in the United States. She was the model for the character Rebecca in Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe, which when I was still in middle school, we were reading. I don't know if any of you were reading it. How did Sir Walter Scott know about her? Washington Irving was a friend of her father's and also a friend of Sir Walter Scott. And that's how we think he became aware of Rebecca. Now, Gratz College was founded by her brother in her honor after she died, and it is still educating Jewish educators today, more than 150 years later. Now, the first ordained rabbi did not make it to the States until 1840 in the community of Baltimore. And before he came, he wrote a letter to the Jewish laymen, and he wanted them to ask if there were any way married women could be forced to go to the mikveh. And I think there was negotiation around that, but of course not possible. Some Jewish women did take the lead in trying to adapt religious practices to the new world. In 1851, there was a congregation in Albany that had the first mixed seating, but it was a practical matter. They bought a church. The church had no women's balcony, so there was mixed seating in the congregation. In 1846, congregations started to introduce the confirmation into their worship to give young women a reason to continue their Jewish education. In 1852, the first prayer book, especially for women, was published, and in the foreword, it said this book is published for maidens, brides, wives, and mothers. Of course, there were records of Jewish women converting to Christianity and Christian women converting to Judaism. The Civil War obviously affected all lives, Jewish and Christian. Most Jews lived in the Union States. It's estimated there were about 125,000 Jews in the Union States and only 25,000 in the Confederate States. Again, this is an estimate, but we're pretty sure about it. 6,000 to 8,000 Jewish Union soldiers, 2,500 Jewish Confederate soldiers. The Jewish Confederates, the Jewish women Confederates, of course, supported the Confederacy, and I'll tell you more about that later. And the Jewish women in the North obviously supported the Union. We know about one of these women because a man named August Bondi, B-O-N-D-I, was a Jewish man who fought with the 5th Kansas Cavalry. Since I'm from Kansas, I was happy to hear that. In his 1910 autobiography, he said that his mother told him that he had to volunteer to fight for the country, and this was his words, which gave equal rights to all beliefs. One second. In the South, we know from the diary of Clara Solomon that New Orleans suffered from the war. When the city fell, she wrote of what she called the great deprivations and humiliation. And I want to quote what she said about the Union commander. If he could only have as many ropes around his neck as there are ladies in the city, and each have a pull, or we could fry him. One Jewish woman, Eugenia Levy Phillips, is thought to have been a spy for the Confederacy in the District of Columbia. We know that she was imprisoned twice for her provocative behavior. She was a mother of 9, and she went to prison at Ship's Island, which was a disease-ridden prison colony. Her unmarried sister, Phoebe Pember, nursed wounded Confederate soldiers in Richmond, Virginia, because anti-Semitism was rampant during the war, both in the South and in the North. Many women hid their religion. Of course, we all know about General Grant's infamous order in 1862 calling for the removal of Jews from the military district of Tennessee. Happy to say that that order was quickly countermanded by President Lincoln as soon as he heard about it. I was doing some more research in preparation for this talk, and something came to me that I hadn't read before. Maybe those of you know it. Apparently, General Grant's father-in-law was a merchant in this area, and he did not want competition from the Jewish merchants. So we think that that's one of the reasons General Grant was persuaded to issue this order. Luckily, it didn't stay issued for very long. In the North, there were many women who were supportive of the war. A woman named Annie Jonas became treasurer of a soldiers' benevolent association called the Needle Pickets. I don't know why that name, in Quincy, Illinois. Her father, Abraham Jonas, was a friend of Abraham Lincoln from Illinois, we know. A woman named Septima Levy personally lobbied Lincoln to promote her husband to general. When he protested, saying that her husband, Charles Collis, was too young, she wrote in her letter back to him, "Not too young to be killed and make me a widow." Charles got his promotion. See, I talked about chutzpah. And she reported that the life of an officer's wife in the District of Columbia could be quite gay, even during the war, and she was friends with Mrs. Ulysses Grant. From war to voting rights, Jewish women were very much involved. One Jewish suffragist named Ernestine Rose spoke at the Second National Women's Rights Congress. She was Polish-born, and she was the only prominent Jewish member in the early days of the movement. They called her the Queen of the Platform because of her fiery rhetoric. She also, in addition to being in favor of women's rights, she was an abolitionist, she was a feminist, and she took on anti-Semitism. American Jewish life after the Civil War changed drastically. Between 1880 and 1924, 2 million Eastern European Jews immigrated to America. Many of the new immigrant men would become peddlers and merchants. And if you'll indulge me, I want to tell you about my grandfather, Harry Specter, who was one of those peddlers. My grandfather came to the United States before the First World War. He had a sister and a brother living in Philadelphia. He came from Ukraine, and he came to escape the Tsar's army. And I'm sure many of you have a similar story in your background. He was 17 when he came here. He was 18 when World War I broke out. He volunteered to fight for the United States in France, and he was very seriously wounded. He came back to the United States, and he rehabilitated in a hospital at what is now Fort Leonard Wood in southern Missouri. When he was discharged and received his back pay, he bought a Model T and some pots and pans and some sheets and pillowcases and household goods and drove around southern Missouri and southeastern Kansas peddling to the farm families in the area. One day he found himself in St. Joe, Missouri, which is a little bit away from Kansas City, and the butcher there talked to him and motioned to a woman whose name was Frida Shannon, said, "Harry, you have a car, take Mrs. Shannon home." And my grandfather, who was very handsome, said, "I will take Mrs. Shannon home if she has a beautiful daughter." Mrs. Shannon said, "I have a beautiful daughter, but she's too young for you." My grandmother Lily was 17 at the time, and my grandfather was 26. Well, the story is that she made them wait until Grandma was 18 before they got married. And I'm sorry to say, I have their beautiful wedding photo in Florida. Yes, those of you who have other homes probably will have this experience. I said to Sal, "Where is that picture? Where is that picture? I can't find it, I can't find it." And he said, "It's hanging in the bedroom in Sarasota." So maybe I'll be able to bring it and show it to you next season. Now, a lot of the immigrant Jewish men were not able to find a beautiful young woman to marry, and they sent back to Europe for their wives when they settled down to start a business. And you can imagine what some of these wives thought, especially when coming from some, very civilized and very cultured areas of Europe, coming here, going on covered wagons or steamboats up and down the Mississippi River. One young woman said she thought she had been brought to the end of the earth. Incidentally, there is a wonderful video on Prime Video, which some of you, I think, have watched, called Jews of the Wild West, and I highly recommend it. They're making you pay 99 cents for it, which, why bother? But it's worth the 99 cents. In St. Louis, which was one of these stopping off places, a woman named Rose Sonnenschein had come from Hungary, and she was the wife of a prominent rabbi. She founded an organization called Pioneers, good name for St. Louis, Missouri, in 1879, which was one of the first women's literary and culture clubs, which I understand is still active today. As many other Jewish women did, Rosa turned to writing to engage with the wider world. After divorcing her philandering husband in 1893, she continued her public career, and she was listed as one of the speakers at the Columbia Exposition, which was held in St. Louis in 1893. She was the main speaker for a gathering of women journalists that year. In 1895, she formed the American Jewess, which was the first English language newspaper for America's Jewish women. She was an ardent supporter of voting rights for women, and she was just one example of an accelerating trend, which was women were going to be active outside their homes, called the New Woman. This was for Christian women and Jewish women, not just Jewish women. Now, one of the reasons for this is the birth rate. Interesting statistics. In 1800, the average married woman in the United States had 7 children. In 1900, the average woman had 3.5 children. Now, some of my friends and I have this continuing argument. Which had more influence on women's lives, reliable birth control or the right to vote? So I'll let you, do this after the lecture. How were women able to do more outside the home? Well, we talked about the declining birth rate, increased life expectancy. Remaining single was not so disfavored, so a lot of women remained single. Technology freed women from some of the more backbreaking and time-consuming labors in the house. At this point, I want to talk about, I'm going to diverge from the book now and talk to you about some of my research, because I think to bring it up to the current day, it's amazing to me how instrumental America's Jewish women were in 3 areas that I'm going to talk about. First of all, labor rights, vital. Activities supporting the country during World War II, and women's rights, feminism. Now, the country really needed a focus on labor rights. One of the reasons is that this huge immigration put workers in peril in the early factories, which were very, very dangerous. Why were Jewish women so predominant? Well, our tradition of civic engagement and advocacy on behalf of those less fortunate. But there's another reason, and the reason is that their husbands supported them both psychologically and financially. And I was never able to find any statistics on, whether Jewish men were more supportive of their women going out to try to make a better society than Gentile, but I think I know the answer, and I'm not going to tell it to you. I think you know it too. One of the Jewish women named Bella Moskowitz said, quote, "To think of others is as natural to the Jewish woman as to breathe." During the late 19th century, most Jewish women concentrated their efforts within the family. In 1872, Esther Levy published the first Jewish cookbook in America. It was strictly kosher. She talked about other Jewish rituals, the mezuzah, how to kosher meat, how important it was to burn a little bit of the dough before you baked your challahs on Shabbat, and Passover rules. Close behind, in 1889, there was a Reform Cook and Advice book. This had a special chapter on how to cook treif. Now, interestingly, and let's think about bringing it up to date, shellfish and ham recipes were given, but not lard or pork. In 1892, Ellis Island opened. Before it shut down, 25 million immigrants went through Ellis Island. 2.5 million Jews. This is 1/5 of the Jewish population of the world. They were chased by pogroms, and they were pulled by the need to make a decent living. Most Jewish women became more American by abandoning their head coverings and adopting the clothing customs of the New World, including wearing shoes every day and not just for special holidays. At first, they did not go out to work. They created homes for the men in big cities. Others created homes in out-of-the-way places that we talked about previously. But already, many were setting up small garment workshops in their home to supplement the income that their men were earning in the factories. It developed that the garment industry became the heart of the Jewish ghetto economy. The single girls would go out to work in the garment factories. The married women would take piecework, sewing buttonholes, sewing on buttons, anything that could be done in the home, some without sewing machines, and some women who were a little bit more advanced were able to buy sewing machines and use them in their home. And entire families worked. I don't know if anyone has ever had the chance to go to the Tenement Museum in Lower Manhattan, but it's a very interesting museum which demonstrates the fact that the homes were actually factories, homes and factories at the same time. In the early 20th century, poverty was just, a wolf's whistle away from the door. If the breadwinner died or couldn't work, the family was, forced into poverty. This sometimes led to suicide or prostitution, which was rampant in immigrant ghettos, along with sexual abuse and incest. In the early 20th century, it's estimated that Manhattan had 15,000 prostitutes serving 150,000 men. One Jewish woman turned adversity to her advantage. Her name was Pearl Adler. She came to America before World War I, thinking that her family was going to join her. Sadly, the war interrupted and her family was never able to come. She had no one to protect her or defend her. The foreman at the garment factory where she worked raped her, and she discovered that she could rent out her apartment to earn extra money to men who were meeting their mistresses. She became one of the most famous madams in America, and I'm sure you know the name Polly Adler. In the 1950s, she wrote a best-selling book called A House is Not a Home, which some of you may have read. I didn't read that one, but in 2021, a prize-winning biography called Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, was published, and I did read that one. Apparently, she said, "Neither depressions nor wars have an adverse effect on the whorehouse business." Now, obviously, she was an anomaly. Most Jewish women were employed as garment workers, but the working conditions were dire. They worked 12 to 14 hours. They worked in locked factories. There was no privacy if you had to go to the bathroom. When they left work, they were searched because the factory owners, were convinced that they were all stealing from them. They worked for lower rates than men. Their rates were always cut, and they really didn't have much power to do anything about it. And these conditions led to a very powerful Jewish labor movement, and many admirable Jewish women worked to improve conditions for all workers. Now, how many of you have heard the name Frances Perkins? Yes. Who was she? Somebody? Secretary of Labor under Roosevelt. First woman in the cabinet. How many of you have heard the name Rose Schneiderman? Okay. Oh, good, good. Arguably, Rose had more influence on FDR in labor relations than did Frances Perkins. Rose was born in Poland in 1882, and when she was 8, her family came to the United States. They moved to the Lower East Side. 2 years later, her father died. Her mother was a seamstress, but so poor that at various times during their lives, her children had to spend time in an orphanage because she just could not take care of them. And Rose had to leave school after 6th grade to go to work as a liner stitcher in a cap factory. She had been working there for 5 years when she founded the first women's local union, the United Cloth, Hat, and Cap Makers. And in 1905, she led the strike of the cap makers for better working conditions and better wages. And the strike was successful, and in 1908, she became an officer of the Women's Trade Union League, and a year later, she helped to organize the famous International Ladies Garment Worker Union industry-wide strike. Unions were ambivalent about signing up women. The unions paid strike benefits to men, but they did not pay strike benefits to women. Rose and the other Jewish women persisted even in the face of violence on the picket lines. Violence much more against women who were on the picket lines than men, maybe because men will fight back. At a public meeting in November of 1909, another Jewish woman named Clara Lemlich urged the group in passionate Yiddish. So you know what proportion of the garment workers were Jewish when you know that this speech was given in Yiddish, to go on strike and to take the oath of the labor union member. And they took the oath from the Psalms, and this was the oath that they were urged to take. If I turn traitor to the cause I now pledge, may this hand wither from the arm I raise. Between 20 and 40,000 strikers did, and they shuttered 450 shops, and they changed the entire industry. Now, not all the strikers were Jewish. Some were Italian and other groups. One Christian woman observer, whose name was Helen Taft, said that she was going to make sure her father heard about the horrible working conditions. Well, that was really good, because her father was President William Howard Taft. Rose also coined the famous phrase, bread and roses. What she meant by that was subsistence wages were not enough. Wages had to be high enough so that women and men could have beautiful things in their lives, as well as just simply enough to eat. In 1911, the famous Triangle Shirtwaist Fire occurred, and it's estimated that between 143 and 146 girls, mostly Jewish girls, were killed in this fire. Rose spoke eloquently and bitterly at a memorial service that was held for them at the Metropolitan Opera House. And I just want to read you just briefly part of what she said. This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap, and property is so sacred. There are so many of us for one job, it matters little if 143 of us are burned to death. I know from my experience it is up to working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement. Rose went on to work for women's suffrage, and she became a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union. Her friend FDR appointed her to the National Labor Relations Advisory Board. She was the only woman who was so appointed. She lived to be 90 years old. She died in 1972, and her obituary in the New York Times said that she taught Eleanor and FDR, quote, most of what they knew about unions. Now, Jewish women protested in other ways. They held strikes for affordable rent. They held strikes for affordable kosher meat. They held rent strikes. They worked for votes for women. When the vote was taken on the amendment that gave women the right to vote, Jewish men voted overwhelmingly to grant women the right to vote. Jewish women were also in the forefront of the fight for reproductive rights. Margaret Sanger was married to a Jewish German immigrant, and one of her friends, a Jewish woman named Fanny Mandel, helped Sanger set up the first birth control clinic in America. Another Jewish woman named Emma Goldman, a name which I'm sure was familiar to some of you, or most of you maybe, who was later deported for her radical activities, wrote and circulated a pamphlet called Why and How the Poor Should Not Have Many Children. She was arrested, and the pamphlet was seized because of the Comstock laws that were first published in 1873 under President Grant. The Comstock laws held that no obscene or material could go through the mails, and they considered, and specifically written in the law, any information about birth control was considered to be obscene. Now, those of us in the legal profession thought that the Comstock laws were overruled in 1965 in the case of Griswold versus Connecticut, which held it was unconstitutional to prevent married couples from using birth control. But a judge in Texas, of course, Texas, revived the Comstock Act and said it was now prohibited to sell mifepristone through the mail. So that case is in the Fifth Circuit now, and it's going up to the Supreme Court. So stay tuned. Central to modern feminism is an important demographic trend. And again, these demographic trends are very interesting to look at. we talked about what happened between 1800 and 1900. Let's talk about what happened in the early part of the 20th century. In 1920, the expected births for a woman of childbearing age in the United States, 3.15. By 1930, 2.45. And for Jewish women, 1.7. I don't think we need to be so happy about that, unfortunately. But nevertheless, up until World War II, most women and men really kept to their different spheres. Women in the home, men in the public arena. Jewish women gave elaborate parties, elaborate dinners. Of course, most of the social life was done in the home because there were no such thing as mixing of Christians and Jews in the social life. Some rare Jewish women were lawyers, professors, and they started businesses before World War II. I'm sure you'll recognize these two names. Helena Rubinstein and S.D. Lauder, who were both European immigrants, founded successful cosmetic companies. Hattie Carnegie was a fashion entrepreneur. Ida Rosenthal started the Maidenform Bra Company. And Frida Lohmann, everybody, discount shopping, right? During World War II, Jewish women were very supportive of the war effort. Prior to the war, many had joined the Communist Party because they thought it was a good venue for combating the social ills of the time. But as soon as World War II started, they served as officers and enlisted personnel. They were pilots, intelligence officers, translators, and code breakers. As a matter of fact, there were so many Jewish women sent to Washington to be code breakers that the man who was in charge of that office called up the dean of Radcliffe and said, "Don't send me any more Jewish women." She didn't pay any attention. She kept sending Jewish women to be code breakers in Washington. They left home to work and replace men, mostly in office work rather than in factories. And always they joined organizations. Hadassah got a lot of its membership during this time. The National Council of Jewish Women, which was under surveillance by the FBI for part of its life. The League of Women Voters. After the war, of course, the Women's Strike for Peace against nuclear weapons. The feminist movement would be unimaginable without Jewish women on the front lines. And I'm going to talk, of course, about the ones that we know. Two of the most famous were Betty Friedan and Bella Abzug, and I'm going to talk about Betty Friedan right now. Betty was a union activist who became the first to publicly identify and named the issue when she published her book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963. For Friedan, it was a small leap from the discrimination she had encountered as a Jew to the discrimination she encountered as a woman. Her book was meant to end women's subordination in the home and the workplace. In 1966, partly influenced by the book, the National Organization for Women was founded. 12% of the founding members were Jewish women. The first female lawyer of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was a Jewish woman whose name was Sylvia Pressman. She had escaped the Nazis and came to America when she was a young woman. There were Jewish women lawyers and Jewish women judges brought and decided sex discrimination cases. Jewish women became the philosophical leaders of the feminist movement too. Many of us remember reading or not reading Susan Brown Miller and Alex Kate Shulman. Some of the writings were really interesting and some of them I couldn't really get through. One woman, Marilyn Saltzman, in the 1960s was thrown out of a Senate hearing on birth control when she stood up and shouted, "Why are only men testifying?" But it's still happening today. I read an article in the Washington Post today about the South Carolina legislature. It has 5 women members, most men, and the men don't want to listen to the women, and they're, putting draconian anti-abortion laws into effect. In the public sphere, one of the most colorful of these women was Bella Abzug. Her father died when she was 13, and you have an idea about what kind of personality she had when I tell you that for a year after he died, she said Kaddish every day for him in an Orthodox synagogue. She had to go to Columbia Law School because at the time she went, Harvard was not accepting women. Her husband was also a lawyer, and they had agreed that she would be able to practice even when they had children. She was very influential in helping John Lindsay, who was a progressive Republican mayor of New York City, get elected. And when he was elected, he asked her, "What position would you like in my administration?" And she said, "What I really want you to do is to influence the Vietnam War and get it stopped." And he said to her, "Well, I want you to go into politics and you'll find out how hard it is to do that." Well, she did. She went into politics, and as we know, she represented the Manhattan Congressional District in Congress from 1971 until 1977. A woman who came just a little later, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was able to go to Harvard because in the meantime, in the 15 years between Bella Abzug and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Harvard decided to admit women to its law school. She always credited her work and on behalf of women to her awareness of being Jewish and an outsider in the society at large. She remembers seeing signs, "No dogs or Jews allowed." While teaching at Rutgers Law School, she created the first class on women in the law, and she went on to argue many sex discrimination cases as an ACLU lawyer on behalf of equality of the sexes. Now, Ruth used her Yiddish cup when she brought her first case before the Supreme Court on sex discrimination. The case is Weinberger versus Weisenfeld, and it's become very famous. The plaintiff was a widower with a young son. Tragically, his wife, who was a school teacher and the main breadwinner, died in childbirth, and he wanted to stay home and raise his young son. But as a widowed father, he was not entitled to the Social Security benefits that a widow, a mother, would be entitled to. So Ruth decided that this was the case she was going to bring to the Supreme Court to be the first case they had to consider on sex discrimination. I don't need to tell you, and it will be no surprise, that the court unanimously held that the provisions were unconstitutional. They were against the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause of the 5th and 14th Amendments. And Ruth was able to, I should call her Justice Ginsburg. Let me not diminish her. Justice Ginsburg was able to use this precedent to create many more opportunities for women at the Supreme Court. And outside of it, the desire for Jewish women to have more equal roles with men in the practice of Judaism was also important. Nadel calls this Jewish feminism. And she explains how hard it was for women to be active and working for equality in the public sphere when they did not feel equal in their synagogues. No women on the bema, we know all of this. No women counted in the minyan, no women rabbis, few, if any, women in positions of authority in Jewish organizations. She gives many other examples, and women banded together to try to correct these conditions. One of the things they did was to write many articles for Jewish publications, and I love the title of one of them, "The Jew Who Wasn't There." And they wrote about how few women were in positions of authority in Jewish organizations. The path to women rabbis was quite long. In 1902, Henrietta Zolt was allowed to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary, but she had to promise that she was not going to seek ordination. Almost 100 years later, 70 years later, the first woman rabbi was ordained by the Reform movement, Sally Pryzand. And 2 years later, the Reconstructionists ordained their first rabbi. It wasn't until 1985 that the conservative movement joined these two other movements, and you all know, and I know because people in my family do, that some progressive Orthodox synagogues have women teaching and leading prayers and ministering to their congregations, but they don't call them rabbis. Now, women wrote new prayers and readings for important moments in a woman's life. Maybe some of you have an orange that you put on the Seder plate. We do in our family. The journal Lilith became very influential. Jewish women who were active in the feminist movement were infuriated about how much anti-Semitism there was. Here in the United States, Christian women said that their religion, Christianity, got rid of all those patriarchal things that Judaism had within it. And internationally, in the movement, Jewish women were shaken when the international movement refused to accept Israeli women, and Israeli women were boycotted, and open anti-Semitism was displayed. Some non-Jews expressed the idea that having Jewish women prominent in the American feminist movement gave it a bad name internationally. They never recognized the need to proclaim solidarity with Israel or to understand the reason that was created in the first place. Now, I have two of my own comments here. This is my comments, and since I'm an inactive judge, it can't really get me in trouble. At least we'll see if it'll get me in trouble. Number one, apparently every group but Jews was able to have liberation movements in the 20th century. And number two, I haven't heard of any protests on college campuses against the Chinese Communist Party for their terrible treatment of Muslim Uyghurs. Have you? Okay. Despite many positive changes, troubling issues remain. This is Nadal, and I agree with her. Jewish organizations, sexual harassment within Jewish organizations, and the Jewish divorce issue, the issue of how difficult it is for some traditional and religious women to get a Jewish divorce, to get a get. And also the horrible treatment of women who want to pray at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, abetted by the Israeli government's tacit approval, the continuing anti-Semitism in the U.S. and the international women's movement. I think she is encyclopedic in covering Jewish women of all different stripes, and I'd like to just read you one of her closing paragraphs. America's Jewish women today include rabbis, Orthodox feminists, devout Hasidim, and lesbians, ardent Zionists, Israelis, and 20, 30, and 40-something-year-olds who first visited Israel courtesy of birthrights free trips. America's Jewish women continue their roles as daughters and daughters-in-law, mothers and mothers-in-law, wives, grandmothers, and singles and widows. They are also real estate moguls, philanthropists, artists, writers, doctors, lawyers, and corporate chiefs. They're also federal judges. I know dozens of Jewish women who sit on the federal bench. And in state courts, like the Massachusetts Court of Appeals, our darling Raya comes from. And they're politicians. There are 10 Jewish women in the House. There are 2 Jewish women in the Senate. I would argue, and I think Nadal would agree, that their being Jewish is an important reason for why they are there. And if you go and look up some of their websites, they will tell you that. Her book shows how we can look back with pride and forward with optimism. I'd like to close by saying that Jewish women have always worked hard for the common good. We are required to do so by the tenets of our religion. In our own Newbridge community, the Social Action Committee, the Environmental Committee, the many charitable groups, both formal and informal, that we have here are headed up by women. And I'm going to close by saying that we Jewish women should be proud of ourselves and of our Jewish partners, male partners, who have almost always supported us in our efforts to bring about a more just society. Thank you so much. I'll take comments or questions. Oh, Michael?
it's open for questions now, and I'd say one of the silver linings of COVID was we were able 3 years later to get your talk here. So Nancy has asked, please be patient till she gets the microphone to you because she's got pain in her back, okay? But we've got questions here.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I just came from North Hills, and they had
Hold it this way.
a talk there on remembering the ladies. This was during the Revolutionary War. But what I noticed in both of these lectures that I've heard is that women weren't written up like men. You know, that probably because of the revolution, the women weren't written up like maybe, well, a little bit more today. But even when you were talking, I don't know where you got all these references from, but I don't know, can you get a book about Jewish women?
Yes.
The one you just wrote.
And this, no, I didn't write it. This is the book. And actually, it's a wonderful book to own. I've gone into it many, many times since I reviewed it for the Sisterhood. And it is in our library. You can check it out of our library. But I urge you to buy it because it's a great addition to anybody's library if you're still having a library now. The name of it is America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, and the author is Pamela S. Nadell, and it is in our library.
And I think one of the reasons that women did the jobs that they did is because men found them foolish, you know, helping other people, getting involved in charity work, the Jewish community, unless they were giving money. That was the main thing. They didn't put themselves, up until recently, I don't know if that's true or not, but I remember the group you just mentioned. I'm not going to talk that long then, because you probably can't hear me anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Judith. I did notice that one of the first two women. Thank you, Judith. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. I did notice that one of the first two Jewish women to come that you mentioned were named Judith.
Judith, yes.
Yes.
Judith Mercado, right.
But my question is this. Do you know if there's any Jewish members of the Daughters of American Revolution?
I don't, but that's a great thing to look up.
There is. That's from a lecture that I took. It's true.
This lady says she heard that there were.
Thank you. I'm going to look it up.
Are there other questions?
His name escapes me, but a Harvard professor, the head of the Jewish Studies program at Brandeis, rather, Harvard, Brandeis, did not give U.S. Grant a bad name. Sarna, Jonathan Sarna. And he wrote a book about Lincoln and the Jews. He wrote a chapter about Grant, and I
know
think
the book.
Grant got a bad name.
In what, can you be more specific about that? How did Grant get the bad name? Did he not issue the order?
It was rescinded but days later because of Grant.
Okay, so it wasn't Lincoln who rescinded it then. Nadell says it was, but as I'm not a historian, I'm not going to get into this fight.
Any more questions, comments? Oh, Nancy Coomer.
Not a question, but a comment. I apologize that I had to run out for a phone call. Jewish women have always been prominent in philanthropic organizations, and Hebrew Senior Life, which started as the Moshe Zakanim, was founded by a group of Jewish women. My grandmother was one of them. So.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Boy, I haven't heard that Yiddish term in
It was
years.
the Moishes the Canaan.
Years.
And they met on Sundays. And I know that my grandmother traveled by trolley from Malden to either Roxbury or Dorchester for those meetings.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Okay.
All right.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Judith for a most spectacular and wonderful talk, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. If I can be I just want to be an advertisement for myself. If you liked this presentation, I'm going to give a formal class in August, 6 sessions on the 8 Jewish justices of the Supreme Court, their lives and legal legacies. Here, yes, right here.